Welcome, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the endometrial cancer research going on in my lab, as well as more broadly at our cancer center. Endometrial cancer is the fourth most common cancer among women in the United States, and is the only major cancer type to be increasing in both frequency and mortality, and we do not completely understand why. In 2021, greater than 66,000 new cases of endometrial cancer will be diagnosed in the United States, and approximately 13,000 women will die from their disease. We do know that obesity, diabetes, and insulin resistance are risk factors associated with developing endometrial cancer. Unfortunately, endometrial cancer has been long understudied, and thus there are limited treatment options for this cancer, especially for women with spread of the cancer beyond the uterus, or what we call metastatic disease. I also want to note that compared to white women in North Carolina, Black women have a twofold increased risk of dying from endometrial cancer, which is clearly unacceptable. So given these statistics, what are we doing at UNC to help improve outcomes for endometrial cancer? I consider my lab to be a true bench-to-bedside lab. What this means is that we first study potential treatments for endometrial cancer in cell lines and mouse models, and things that look promising, we then move these therapies into clinical trials for endometrial cancer. My lab has actually helped to create about 20 new mouse models to study endometrial cancer over the years in an attempt to reflect all the different types of mutations found in endometrial cancer tumors. Just as a reminder, we know that cancer develops due to mutations or changes in the DNA of our cells that leads to uncontrolled growth, and eventually a tumor or cancer forms that can spread or metastasize. In my lab, our focus has been on diet interventions, exercise, and drugs that target metabolism as ways to better treat and prevent endometrial cancer. In this pursuit, we have studied diets such as those low in fat, and now we're quite excited about intermittent fasting as another diet that may improve endometrial cancer outcomes and even be helpful during chemotherapy. We also have looked at exercise, particularly high-intensity interval training, or HIIT. This slide shows the list of the many drugs we have studied in my lab. The common theme of this list of drugs is that many target metabolic pathways important for cancer growth that are focused on lipids, insulin, and glucose. These are much-needed pathways for endometrial cancers to develop and thrive, and the goal of these drugs is to shut these pathways down and stop the cancer from growing. I also have an interest in drugs that target our immune system and help our immune system do a better job in fighting endometrial cancer. So that's the bench part of my lab, but here's the bedside part. I'm happy to report that this is a list of just some of the clinical trials that have evolved from the work in our lab. Most of these are ongoing trials or in the process of opening at UNC. I also list here some of my key collaborators for these projects. So now I want to circle back to this alarming fact that Black women have a much greater risk of dying from endometrial cancer than white women in both North Carolina and the United States, and we desperately need to know why. We do have a few clues about this from a gene sequencing study performed at UNC called UNC-SEEK. UNC-SEEK was a Lineberger-sponsored targeted gene sequencing effort across cancer types with greater than 10,000 patients enrolled, including 325 endometrial cancer patients. The goal was to define the mutations among many different cancers. We did compare Black versus white endometrial cancer patients and found that Black patients more often presented at advanced versus an early stage of disease, with advanced stage meaning cancer that has spread beyond the uterus, and that is much more difficult to treat. Black women also had a greater risk of their cancer coming back, which we call recurrence of their disease. In addition, the tumors in Black women were more likely to have mutations associated with more aggressive behavior. However, the problem with this study, as well as others like it, is the underrepresentation of tumors from Black women. In essence, we only had tumors from 58 Black women compared to 267 white women. Thus, we really need more information and more tumors to confirm these findings, and then most importantly, figure out what to do to improve outcomes for our Black endometrial cancer patients. Thus, to hopefully begin to address racial disparities in endometrial cancer, we've embarked on the Carolina Endometrial Cancer Study. Our leadership team is shown here. We opened officially in September of 2020. This study is generously supported by our Lineberger Cancer Center. The Carolina Endometrial Cancer Study is a North Carolina-based population study that will enroll women from all 100 counties in North Carolina. The mission of the study is to enroll Black endometrial cancer patients one-to-one with white endometrial cancer patients. The overall goal is to enroll 1,000 women in 3 years with baseline interview and tumor data, including 500 Black women. If we sequence the tumors from all 500 Black women enrolled, we will have sequenced 10 times the number that has been done previously for any single study. In brief, the study includes baseline interviews and then follow-up interviews at 12 and 24 months after diagnosis. Medical records will also be obtained to assess details around diagnosis, treatment, and outcomes. Lastly, tumor will be obtained for genetic or mutational sequencing. Our hope is that this study will shed much needed light on this alarming disparity for Black women battling this disease. In addition, this study will give us great insight in better understanding endometrial cancer overall. This type of population-based study has not been done previously for endometrial cancer, and we are so excited to be up and enrolling. Lastly, I'm going to touch on one last research interest in my lab, and this is of the microbiome. In essence, the microbiome describes all the bacteria that live in our body. Humans are actually outnumbered on the order of 10 to 1, which means we have more bacterial cells than human cells in our body. More and more evidence suggests that the microbiome of our gut plays a role in cancer development as well as response to treatment for cancer. However, very little is known of the microbiome of the uterus. In our mouse models, we have found that endometrial cancer significantly changes the microbiome of both the gut and uterus, and the microbiome of the gut and uterus also changes with our diet and with chemotherapy. Thus, our goal is to find ways that we can potentially manipulate the microbiome to improve our cancer treatments. Thus, we are in the process of opening a study where we will follow changes in the microbiome of the gut and uterus as endometrial cancer patients go through surgery and chemotherapy. This study should open in the late fall, so more to come. So hopefully this talk gave everyone a flavor of the endometrial cancer research going on at UNC, which we are very passionate about. Lastly, I just want to give many thank yous, first by acknowledging all those who work in my lab, all my wonderful collaborators, as well as my grant support throughout the years. And lastly, I want to sincerely thank Lisa Milligan and Golfing for the Gals for all their hard work in bringing this event together, especially during the pandemic. I am honored to be part of the mission of Golfing for the Gals and bringing greater awareness to endometrial cancer and endometrial cancer research. I also want to thank everyone who cared enough to be here today in support of endometrial cancer. Thank you.